Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
He carefully pretended to listen attentively to the small, fat little man. The sweet speeches of the potential partner, backed up by expressive epithets, pleased his ears, but no more than that. Over many years in business, Kevin had learned to determine people's intentions by their breathing. And in Peter, this vital indicator was far from normal. The interlocutor suddenly fell silent, as if he had read Kevin's thoughts. But the master of the office doubted that this rogue had the poetic ability to lighten the atmosphere a little. He asked Peter, "I'm not against your proposal, but I need guarantees. You understand how difficult it is to redirect production without additional investment, and the risk is not always justified. Do you understand what I'm saying?" The visitor suddenly became agitated, and his face was covered with drops of sweat. Kevin felt disgusted, because the creepiest thing for him was shaking a sweaty hand. This rejection was present in him on an intuitive level, and he studiously avoided even brief interactions with people who had such a disadvantage. But Peter did not refer to just glasses, because in the hands of this fat man was practically the entire regional business. And to send him out of the door just like that would be a fatal mistake. Peter knew perfectly well the answers to all the questions that had been asked, but he remained silent, enjoying the long pause. To jump on his horse, he would have been allowed by the victim's repeated questions, but this tactic was familiar to Kevin, and he calmly waited. The situation was saved by the secretary, who entered the office without a warning knock and neatly arranged the cups of oversized coffee on the coffee table. Peter reached up with his nose and rolled his eyes at the divine aroma. Such a rare kind of coffee. Kevin grinned contentedly. You guessed it. I'm used to the best of everything. But how do you get such a valuable product? I have a reliable supplier. Peter looked at the owner of the office with respect. After all, not every entrepreneur can afford one of the world's most expensive drinks. This look meant a confident victory for Kevin, because after the treat, Peter spoke in a different way. Let's get back to your question, which is about guarantees. I am sure that we will find common ground. After all, a merger is beneficial to both parties. The products of your small enterprise are very popular, and it seems to me that with proper promotion we will be able to expand the consumer market many times over. Kevin knew exactly where he was going with this. Peter. He took a small sip and sharply shifted his gaze from the window to his face. That's right. And the profits will multiply too. And what percentage will I get out of your largesse? Peter froze in his chair, and the owner enjoyed his confusion. In his mind, he was already attributing the second winning point to himself, and prepared to put forward his own terms to his opponent. But Peter was unexpectedly quick to recover from the blow. He carefully moved the cutlery away from him. Thank you for the wonderful coffee. It was very interesting and even useful to talk to you. We will certainly take into account all your claims. I think my lawyers will contact Frank soon, and we can do all the I's and cross all the I's. That was a punch to the solar plexus. It was the kind of punch in the nose Kevin didn't expect, but Peter enjoyed his well-deserved victory. He deftly put the youngster in his place, showing him that he was not solving anything, as if he was finishing off his opponent. Peter held out a sweat-streaked hand. See you soon, Kevin. Say hello to your father for me. The door closed behind the visitors, and Kevin was still reeling from the ignominious defeat. His right hand froze in midair, as if that could clear it from the unpleasant touch, the hands of a foul man. Kevin had placed great hopes on this encounter, but Peter had made it clear to him that he had no intention of considering his opinion. Irritation overwhelmed the man and demanded an outlet. Under the hot hand of the chief, without realizing it, fell into the secretary. She opened the door without warning. Kevin, your mom called. You went ballistic. Molly, you've been working here all these years and you can't learn to knock first. At least that's what normal secretaries do. The unfortunate woman is often behind the eyes. But you said yourself that if it's urgent, it's okay. Since when did my relatives' calls become urgent? The secretary slipped out the door. Kevin felt himself pounding with anger and an inexplicable fear. He had experienced this unpleasant feeling many times before, but he could not understand the nature of its origin. The man took 10 deep breaths, which helped to bring his nervous system back to normal, and instead of anger, he began to feel remorse, for which Molly was offended. He should go and apologize. He said these words aloud and firmly opened the door. "Molly, come in for a moment." The secretary's eyes reddened from the span of their tears, and Kevin became unbearably ashamed of his wild act. He stepped closer to the woman. "Molly, I beg you, I'm sorry, I won't make excuses, because this behavior is unacceptable. Just please forgive me. I promise you that it won't happen again." The secretary smiled forcefully. "It's not a big deal. I've gotten used to a lot of things over the years." True, Frank never shouted at me extinguished, was aggression once again stirring inside. But Kevin suppressed the urge to spew another portion of negativity at the secretary. From this emotional outburst, he still could not resist. He expressed his dissatisfaction to his assistant in a ministerial tone. "Molly, advice for the future: never speak in the presence of one manager about the merits of his predecessor. I am well aware of my father's qualities, and I don't need to be reminded of that." The woman blushed and lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry, I didn't know that, Frank. I'm sorry, I'll take your remarks into consideration." She was about to leave, but Kevin stopped her. "You said my mother called?" "Yeah, Betty really wanted you to call her back as soon as you were free." "Thank you." The man nodded to the secretary and hurried away. He picked up his cell phone, but didn't immediately dial the familiar number. He's not yet at peace with his soul. Anger at his increased self-esteem. He really wanted to feel himself the sole owner of the company, but his subordinates and partners constantly remembered his father. And that pissed off the young man more than anything else. He muttered aloud, "Now his mother will throw something like this. I'm sick of these relatives." Betty answered at once, but she started with reproach. "Kevin, I haven't been able to reach you for 2 hours. Daddy was sick again. He's on the first landline right now. Get over here as soon as you can. Jacob, Jenna, and is already here." Kevin couldn't help but be sarcastic. Mom could have left that out. "My brother has amazing instincts. He's the first one to show up for holidays and funerals." Betty raised his voice, wondering what you were talking about. "Your irony is misplaced right now. Father is in a serious condition, so I'm asking you very much." The feeling of shame lowered again with sharp townships right in her heart. Kevin's eyes even darkened and his breath caught. He was silent for a few seconds, and then quietly said, "Mom, I'm sorry, I understand, and I promise to behave myself. I'll be at the hospital in about 15 minutes. At his appearance in the waiting room, Molly jumped up. But he warned her question today, "I will not be there until the end of the working day, so postpone all meetings to tomorrow, or better yet, another week." The secretaries sympathized. "Asked something serious with Frank?" "Apparently, yes. Mom said he's in intensive care." Molly covered her mouth with her palm, and her eyes filled with tears again. Kevin thought that he, too, would have liked to have such loyal employees as his father's constant secretary. He didn't want to remember that he had already found a replacement for Molly. Tension began to rise again. The most unhappy thoughts swirled in his head. But most of all, Kevin was worried about how his father would dispose of his property. Frank had had health problems for a long time, but in the last few months he had lost a lot of weight, and the eldest son understood perfectly well that the hour was near when the management of the company would pass to him. He had never even considered any other option. The first person he met outside the hospital was his brother Jacob, smoking at the entrance, ignoring the menacing sign. Smoking was strictly forbidden on hospital grounds. Kevin shook his brother's hand. "Hey, I thought you quit." Jacob took his eyes to the side. "I couldn't help but realize that things were bad. We don't know for sure yet. The doctors are having a concilium to decide what to do. As soon as Mom called, Jenna and I came right over, so I know. I was delayed by Peter, so I couldn't come right away." Jacob looked at his brother carefully. "You should stay away from that prankster. Do you know what kind of reputation he has?" Kevin rudely interrupted Jacob. "I don't need counselors." The younger brother only shrugged his shoulders, "As you know." The men walked to the spacious hallway where the doctors and women were waiting for the verdict. Upon seeing her eldest son, Betty stood up from the couch. Kevin gently put his arm around the woman. "Mom, don't cry. Dad never had a seizure. He's strong, and the doctors in this hospital are the best. Believe me, everything will be all right. Oh, son, I'm afraid it's more serious this time. Mom, let's not make any predictions. Let's wait to see what the experts have to say." It didn't take long, although the minutes seemed long for the relatives. Shortly after Kevin arrived, a group of people in white coats entered the hall. A tall woman approached them. "Are you relatives?" "Yes." "Doctor, can you tell me what's wrong with your father?" "Jacob." They got up from their seats too. Only Betty sat staring at one point. The doctor looked at the trio. "Unfortunately, I have nothing to tell you. Your father's condition is critical. And the saddest thing is that it's impossible to operate now. The patient will not survive it. So my colleagues and I have decided to observe your father until morning, and then we will decide how to proceed." Jacob asked, "Can we see him?" The doctor looked at him with judgment. "Young man, now, even the slightest disturbance could lead to tragic consequences. So a visit is out of the question. If the patient feels better tomorrow morning, then perhaps we can authorize a short visit." "Okay, we'll wait until morning." The doctor shrugged. "Why torture yourself? Let's just go home." And the seconds and minutes dragged on again, slowly dissipating into space. Kevin was nervous and often ran outside. The smell of tobacco wafted from him. Betty realized that he, too, had followed his half-brother's example, but the woman thought it inappropriate to reprimand her son in such a situation. She only warned both boys, "You'd be less likely to poison yourselves. It won't help your father anyway." Outside the hospital windows, dusk began to fade. When the tall doctor reappeared, "Your relative is on a rampage, demanding his sons and his wife. Walk quietly, but not more than 2 minutes. I'll let you stay in the ward." They pulled on gowns and shoe covers and followed the doctor into the ward. Frank's face was unrecognizable. Blue covered his cheekbones and forehead, and his nose and chin were sharply defined. Kevin breathed in the drug-soaked air, and in that mixture, he caught the odor of death. The father made a sign to his sons to come closer. His voice was weak but confident. "Guys, I know that you didn't get along well with each other, but please, forget the quarrels, help each other, and don't hurt your mother. The lawyers got all the paperwork. I've done my homework. I want everything to be fair." The man closed his eyes and breathed heavily. The features of his face shot up even more, and the sons realized that this was their father's last admonition. The doctor whispered, "All go." The brothers saw their mother bending over their father. They went out into the hall where Jacob's wife was still sitting alone. By the expression on the brothers' faces, they didn't realize that nothing good was to be expected. The weight of impending trouble pressed on the mind, and they did not want to speak. A few minutes later, Betty came out. The woman snuggled into her eldest son's chest and burst into tears. "How will we all live without Frank now?" The doctor looked sympathetically at the relatives, but she was no longer able to help their grief. Frank also clearly realized that his time in this world was coming to an end, but the opportunity to say goodbye to his loved ones relieved his soul. And now he was recollecting all the significant events of his long life. Frank grew up as a calm child, and then it was as if he had been replaced. He was afraid to get into fights, if anyone dared to hurt the weak in front of him. For this reason, the boys' parents were frequent visitors to the school. But Martin didn't scold his son. He only once lamented and noticed that you, Frank, stick up for those who can't stand up for themselves. That's fine. But remember, that kind of chivalry isn't always justified. Besides, you two may one day be beaten so badly that you'll forget your mother. Adriana, I didn't like that my husband was so dismissive of my son's outrageous behavior. She demanded that he take harsher measures, and she told her son the board was itchy. Frank will write you a wolf ticket, and you will have to sweep the streets all your life. The young man took his mother's criticism with a smile. Mom, it's strange that you're describing such a future to me. How is your son worse than other kids? You also ask why you are always on the edge. Do you need more than others? Mom, I'm for justice. When you get a bad report from school and you can't go to college, then you'll know all about justice. Despite his hot temper, Frank studied well. From childhood, he dreamed of a career as an officer, and was sure that he would enter a military school. But his mother was right. The characteristic let him down. It was too late to choose another educational institution. So his father arranged for his son to work at the factory where he worked. It's nothing, Frank. Such practice is good for a bit. Space for a year, will settle down, and the next year you'll apply again. But these plans were not destined to come true, because in the spring he received a summons from the military enlistment office. Upon seeing this message, Adriana yelled at the whole entrance. To her only son. Martin tried to calm Adriana's wife. What are you going to read? Frank will serve his time as a dead man and come back. What if they send him to Afghanistan? How many guys have already come home in zinc coffins? You'd be kidding me. No one would send green boys to war in a foreign country, but the premonition didn't fail. Mother and Frank, after 3 months in training school, went together with the same guys to the hottest spot on the planet. And they were not even warned about the place of further service. Just in the evening, they were ordered to gather and line up on the formation. For several days, they traveled by train and then by car through the scorched desert. The new recruits only there realized where they were to undergo the school of courage. On the road, Frank met James. This humorous guy was the soul of the company and entertained the soldiers with anecdotes. Only at the end of the journey, when they were already on the territory of a friendly state, James shared his worries. You know, Frank, I am not afraid of death in principle. It's just a shame that there won't even be anyone to cry for me. That's the confession of a 20-year-old boy. It touched me to the core, Frank, that you have no one at all. No orphanages. All I know is that my mom dropped me off at the door of the orphanage in the winter. That's what the nurses told me. Good thing she thought to tangle me in a blanket. What difference does it make? Either I'd be dead then, or I'd be killed now. James, you can't be in that mood. Come on, finish this thing. You and me, we're going to be fine. Frank must have spoken convincingly, because James really cheered up after that conversation. The young guy's friendship grew stronger every day. And after the first badass encounter, when they were ambushed, but thanks to James' cunning, they made it out alive. The young men became even closer. In 2 years, the friends had to look death in the eye more than once, but they were unusually lucky. I think they even came up with a nickname for them, the couple with the reservations. Everyone who had to be in hot spots knows that in war, 1 day lived is equal to a month. And all the soldiers were looking forward to the demobilization. James and Frank were looking forward to a peaceful life too. Frank, I don't know about you, but I'm getting married right away. James, but first you have to find a bride. James laughed with glee. What do you think? I wasted a trip to the infirmary. Wait a minute. I didn't realize that. That you're there for a reason? Who's Kate or Cindy? Frank saw his friend blush for the first time, but he didn't mock him. He said understandingly, "It seems that you are great. You hit me hard, but I'm afraid that suddenly she will refuse. So you do not delay with this case, or someone will steal the girl from under your nose." James did not have time to tell the pretty nurse about his feelings, because the medical unit was soon disbanded. The boy lamented his indecision. How stupid am I? Where am I supposed to find Cindy now? James will find another girl. Any girl would gladly go for such a hero. I don't want another girl. You see, Frank would be happy to help his friend, but he didn't know how to do it. James repeatedly made attempts to find out the address of the missing girl, but there was no way to find out the identity of the employees. I'll find her anyway. This promise sounded like a vow, and Frank believed that his comrade will definitely fulfill it. Before mobilization, the friends decided not to part. James, I've grown so fond of you these past 2 years. Maybe we'll continue to move through life together. James didn't think long. I don't mind, but do you at least have a place to land? Well, I'm broke. I went to vocational school after the orphanage. I worked there for 2 years and was drafted into the army. Buddy, what's to stop us with a little thing like that? You can stay with me for a while. My parents won't mind. And then we'll find you a job, so that you can even work at your father's factory with a hostel. Encouraged by these plans, the young men returned to their homeland. But in 2 years, the country had changed a lot, and people had become different too. The changes, which were shouted about from every TV set, also affected the Frank family. Demobilized from the soldiers, he did not recognize his parents. Always judicious mother became like a scandalous commodity from the market, and his father was in despondency for days. Martin met his son without much joy. Our factory is on the verge of closing. They shut down our shop 2 months ago. They say it's unprofitable. What's that word you're using? Now your mother and I are sitting at a broken through and thinking. During this pessimistic speech of her husband, Adriana was preparing dinner and meager supplies. You have a bad habit of making things worse. We have to be patient and everything will change. The head of the household just waved his hand. And another student's change of heart. Only an idiot would believe the empty promises of the people who started it. So use your brain. You are not a stupid woman and should realize that all these changes will lead us to ruin. The young people did not immediately appreciate the magnitude of these changes. At first, they had the feeling that they were in the looking glass, and they only had to make a step to return to the place where everything was familiar and familiar. But no one knew which way to take that step. James had just spent the night at a friend's house and was getting ready. "Frank, I'm going to go. You've got enough problems without me." But the comrade interrupted him. "Don't make it up. It's always harder alone." We agreed to stick together. Adriana supported her son James. "Do not go away. You're not embarrassing us at all." And Frank's right. It's not going to be easy today. And James stayed, but decided that he would not hang on the neck of the hospitable hosts. The guys started looking for work right after they got back, but they found nothing but a position as a loader at the railroad station. In those troubled times, even such a job was considered happiness. The pay was piecework, which suited the guys and annoyed the other men in the brigade. "Why are you tearing up so far? Or do you need more than others?" After the Affenhell, friends were not afraid of such attacks and bravely answered the disgruntled. "Yes, we want to live normally. That's why we tear our belly button." Such an answer did not please some members of the labor collective, which consisted mainly of cadres with a bright biography. The foreman himself once warned them, "Guys, would you be careful with these scumbags? Almost every one of them has a shiv in his pocket." The guys thanked the man for the warning, and he regretfully said, "If I had all the guys like you in my brigade, I would not know any grief. But when you are surrounded by only thugs, it's not that you can't work, it's scary to walk." Apparently, someone heard this unflattering characterization and decided to put the foreman in his place. Especially violent comrades organized a showdown. When the unloading of the wagon was coming to an end, the foreman led the process. "Men, let's do a little more, and we can go home." One zealous comrade brazenly declared the commander. "First, the calculation, and then finish the job." Brigadier calmly replied, "No. First finish the work, and then get the money. Do you know the rules? And I will not change them. We'll make you do it." Several active men began to surround the foreman. Apparently, the corps of provocateurs hoped for support from the others. But James and Frank stood up for the foreman. "Men, stop messing with the water. There's not much left. Let's finish the job and get out of here." The guys' intercession didn't endear them to the agitated crowd, who jumped on them without warning. But apparently, the mob didn't expect such a rebuff from the young men. It was not a minute before the chief instigators were writhing in pain on the ground. The others scattered when it all dissipated. The brigadier approached them. "Guys, thank you very much. But you better not come here again. Those things won't forgive the humiliation and will be waiting around the corner." The men started writing something quickly in their notebooks. "Have you recently mobilized?" Frank answered him. "Yeah, been in Afghanistan almost 2 weeks." The foreman guessed. "Can you tell? I can see your faces are tanned. It's almost winter." "I used to work in law enforcement. I left, but I still have my professional skills. I just clicked on an address for you. Why don't you go there? Say something." The foreman paid them generously and wished them luck. The friends gave all the money they earned to Adriana that night, which made her very happy. And my left hand was still touching from the morning. I thought, where could the money come from? And here was such wealth. I didn't believe in omens after that. Tomorrow I'll go to the market. I'll buy some meat and make you a real roast. The next morning, the young men went to the address given to them by the foreman. They were very surprised to find themselves at the door of the semi-basement of the new premises, above the entrance of which was a gingerly written sign, Agency Rubicon, Protection of Life and Property. Although the office didn't look too presentable, the boys had no choice. They resolutely opened the door and found themselves in a small room with a single desk, behind which a young man of their age sat proudly. He came to life at once. What was the question? He said, "Will you help us with our work?" The master of the office rejoiced. "Oh, if Anthony himself referred you, then I'm obliged to help you. We used to work together, fighting crime. But when everything changed and ex-criminals began to rule, we left the agencies. I decided to start my own business." The owner of the agency suddenly laughed. "Guys, you have no idea how crazy this world is. I used to catch bandits, and now I protect them for a lot of money." I offered Anthony to join, but he turned me down. Said he had no moral compass to stoop so low. I guess when you can't feed your family and you're hungry, you can spit on all the conventions. The friends were in complete agreement with their new boss, who asked them to call them simply by their first name, Chuck. After employment in Rubicon, the guy's life gradually improved. Earnings allowed James to rent a comfortable apartment connection, helped him find his love, Cindy. But Frank was ahead of his friend with marriage and even had time to have a son. When James jokingly reproached him, "Frank, you are in such a hurry to live that I cannot keep up with you," the friend also jovially replied to him, "And I decided to go ahead of schedule just in case. After all, in this life, anything can happen. So you have to use every day with maximum efficiency." After Afghanistan, Frank's intuition sharpened, and he learned to anticipate the next turn of fate long beforehand. Way ahead of time. He felt that he and his comrade would soon have to look for a new job. But James didn't say anything. For more than 5 years, Rubicon flourished from clients. There was no shortage, and Chuck was even able to rent more decent premises for the office. The staff had also increased, and the company was looking forward to the brightest prospects. But one comrade from the former law enforcement officials decided to neutralize the competitor. First on Chuck was unknown complainers faked a denunciation that his employees exceeded authority. Then the company was raided by representatives of financial services, which revealed huge debts on payment. But Chuck smelled the fry in time and fled abroad. Rubicon was declared bankrupt, and all employees were out of work overnight. James and Frank were very painfully experiencing another setback. "James, where do you and I roll the dice now? I don't know how to get out of this situation. I'm in debt, and I've got rent to pay and a car payment to make. And Kevin's growing up, and he's got to be fed and clothed." A friend pulled a fast one on Frank. "What are you wearing? You're not the only one in this situation. By the way, I've got a family and a son growing up too. It's a good thing Cindy works, but a nurse's salary is a pittance. One thing's for sure, we'll have to find another job. Well, we have experience in unloading railroad cars. Maybe we'll fall back on the brigade." "No, that's out of the question. And I've heard that everything's been taken care of there. We'll have to find something else." "James, what are we going to find if we don't know how to do anything? All we know is how to take the enemy down." James looked at Frank the way a teacher looks at a student. "Frank, you got it right, don't you? Such specialists are always in demand." "You mean to tell us that Frank froze half-heartedly because the prospect of going to a place where there is a war again frightened him. But James asked in the same even voice, "If you have any other options, come on." "Understand, brother, we have no other option." They told their wives that they were going to work on a rotational basis in one of the countries of the collapsed socialist camp. And they themselves signed a contract before departure. They were given a substantial advance payment. And in the terms of the contract, there was a clause that guaranteed a substantial payment to the family in case of death. This was a very important point, which played a decisive role in the conclusion of the contract for 2 years. Of course, it was impossible to compare the previous service experience with the new mission. After all, now they had become real professionals. But they did not have to choose, and they tried especially not to put heroes to stay alive. When the term of the contract was coming to an end, Friends by old habit began to make plans for the future. It was always James who initiated the idea. "Frank, I've been racking my brains and thought that we shouldn't throw money away, we should invest it in some profitable business." "James, I've been thinking about that myself, but there are huge risks. We don't want to fail because our people are enterprising, so everything is already taken care of." "I agree. There are risks, but you can, for example, unite with those who already have experience. Frank didn't like this idea and our partners will dump us at the first opportunity. No, this arrangement is definitely not suitable for us." But James suddenly suggested something that had never occurred to Frank. "You're small-minded, Frank, and you've forgotten all about your parents." The boy didn't understand his friend's point at first. "What makes you think I've forgotten?" "I write to them every chance I get, and I send them news too." James smirked. "That's not what I mean. Your folks have adapted well to the new value system and are holding on pretty well." "Frank, you mean we should open a shop and trade stuff too?" "We can start with that, but the trade will be more fruitful if we allow customers to eat on the spot in comfort. Kind of like Terry's Coffee." "Yeah." Frank thought about it for a while, and then he exclaimed, "James, you're a genius." "And why don't I get any smart ideas like that?" "Because you're thinking small. You've got to push the envelope a little bit." The young men became infected with the new idea. They even sketched out a minimum plan for the near future. But the unexpected happened. Just before the end of their contract, their convoy was ambushed. During the service, James and Frank had to perform various tasks, but mostly they accompanied humanitarian cargoes. That day, they were also traveling at the head of the convoy, when suddenly one shell exploded ahead, then another. Shouts were heard from all sides, and people began to scatter in search of shelter. The friends also hurried to leave the car frozen in place, but right in front of them something exploded, and the world plunged into darkness. Frank must have been unconscious for a short time, because when he opened his eyes, the fog had not yet cleared. He heard nothing and tried to get up, but immediately collapsed to the ground. At that moment, external sounds broke through, and the man clearly heard someone breathing hoarsely nearby. Frank turned with difficulty and saw James's eyes, but those eyes were no longer filled with merry little devils. There was a cosmic abyss in them. He began to shake his friend. Hold on. Don't you dare die. You and I have so much more to do. The medics will run now and will get you to the hospital." The wounded friend and man smiled and whispered to Frank, "Don't leave mine behind, please." James' eyes still looked up into the blue sky as well, but there was no longer a spark of life in them. Frank shattered his friend's vital bodies and shouted and leave James. "This isn't fair." Strangers appeared nearby and pulled Frank away from his friend's body. Screams were heard from all sides and he passed out again. When Frank came to, there were white walls all around, and a woman's voice was heard from far away. He woke up, our sick man, came to his senses. Frank opened his eyes with great difficulty, and through the soapy veil saw the face of an unfamiliar man with glasses above him. "Are you angels?" There was laughter. "We're even joking." "That's very good." "No, brother, it's too early for you to talk to angels. Live on this world." Frank spent almost 3 months in the hospital. When he was discharged, the same doctor with glasses told him he must have been born with a shirt on. "Your whole body was riddled with shrapnel. It took us a long time to get all the iron out of you. But there was one bad piece left. We couldn't get it out because there's a huge risk." The man lived with that shard for more than 20 years, and he believed he'd lived just as long. But he didn't. Frank felt something warm and painfully familiar touch his hand. He whispered, 3, it's good to have you around." He wanted to say that he loved his wife very much, but an unknown force lifted him up and carried him somewhere. He felt so light and good that he wanted to sing. But suddenly the flight was cut short, and Frank found himself in an unfamiliar place, where everything was green and birds were singing. Toward him did not go, but also floated above the ground and his friend James. "Here we are, Frank, we're back together. I've been waiting for you." Betty cried silently, and the tears dripped onto the white robe left over her clothes. She felt how slowly her husband's strong hand was cooling down, and mentally said goodbye to the dearest person. A nurse came up. "He's dead." I'm sorry for your loss." The woman realized she had to leave the room. She turned to the girl in the white coat. "Thank you for letting us say goodbye. You'll probably get a beating from the doctor on duty. But what can I do? I'm human too." Jacob and Jenna were waiting for her in the lobby. They didn't ask anything because they could tell by the look on her face. Betty looked around the spacious room and said in a tired voice, "Kevin never waited." Jacob hurriedly explained his brother's absence. Kevin got a call, and he said he had an urgent matter. "Mom, don't take offense at him, because life goes on and the living have their own worries." Jacob tried not to look at his mother. He was ashamed of his brother, but to discuss Kevin's behavior at such a moment was at least inappropriate. Jenna was ironing laundry and watching Nick, who was fiddling on the floor with a construction set. By the strained and tense look on her 5-year-old son's face, the woman realized that his process wasn't going quite so smoothly. "Nick, can I help you?" The kid, without taking his eyes off the case, muttered to himself, "All right, I won't get in your way. But if something doesn't work out, you shouldn't refuse to help. Dad will be here soon. He'll tell you how to put it together properly. At least tell me you're building a school. Oh, maybe you should have started with a little house. Mom, did you forget? I've already built a little house. Now I want a school with a pool. Well, go for it." Nick huffed and puffed for a long time, but then he suddenly destroyed the imperfect structure. "I can't do it." Jenna turned off the iron and squatted down next to her son. "It's not working because you're angry. Let's rest for a while and then we'll build your school together." "I agree." The boy looked at his mother carefully. "You don't believe it." The woman was surprised. "Nick, have Daddy and I ever lied to you?" "Yes, you promised we'd go to the zoo." "I see. You resented us. But there was a good reason, and we had to postpone the trip." "I know. Grandpa died." "That's a good reason." "Yes, son. Who told you about Grandpa?" "Uncle Kevin. He told me that Grandpa Frank died and that the sweet life is over for us now." "Mom, what's a sweet life?" "It's when a man eats a lot of candy and drinks a lot of lemonade." Her son's statements stumped the woman, and she thought hard about how to answer him so that he would understand. "No, son, it's a little different. Let's go to the kitchen and help me make dinner. Daddy will be home from work soon." Switching the baby's attention to another object always helped the young mother to get out of difficult situations. Nick liked to be stuck in the kitchen more than anything else in the world and gladly accepted his mother's offer. The baby watched Jenna with mesmerized eyes and performed her little errands with undisguised joy. Soon he forgot about what Uncle Kevin told him, but didn't automatically do her usual work. Salma thought about everything that was going on in the family. After Frank's passing, her husband's half-brother lost all decorum. The first thing he did was to remove Jacob from the company. And Kevin did it in public and in a humiliating way. But Jacob held his dignity and left the company with his head held high. Now Kevin demands to vacate the apartment, which was given to them by her husband's father. This is what he hinted at a few days ago, Jenna, when they accidentally met at the mall. The rightful heir, as Kevin has called himself, has been sewing up the lives of the adult members of the family, and now it had gotten to their little son. This circumstance most of all angered the young woman. Unhappy thoughts Jenna interrupted by her husband, who cheerfully shouted from the hallway, "There are living people in this house." Nick rushed to meet his father. "Dad, I'm helping Mom cook." Jacob laughed. "Now I'll help you too. Just my hands, I think." Jenna had learned at a distance to determine the mood of her spouse. And now she realized that his cheerfulness is fake. When Jacob came into the kitchen, the woman put her cheek for a kiss. Quietly asked how you were doing. "Did you find out anything?" The man answered evasively. "I tried, but it's not that simple. Let's talk after dinner. I don't want to spoil my appetite." "You're right. And our cape has ears like locators." For some time after Frank's funeral, the couple avoided discussing the inheritance's unfair distribution. A few days after the funeral service, the brothers went to the lawyer to familiarize them with the will. Betty was also present during this procedure. But when the lawyer read out all the clauses of the document, she did not hide her surprise. "This can't be true. Frank himself told me before his death that he had made the arrangements so as not to offend anyone. But it turns out that the company and everything else will go to Kevin. Jacob only gets the apartment. The eldest son remarked with undisguised sarcasm, "That's right. Mom, I'm the legitimate son, and Jacob is just a sidekick. Don't you dare say that." Dad treated Jacob like his own son. Kevin interrupted his mother. But at the last minute, Dad decided to do what the law requires. And Jacob has nothing to complain about. And I think he should be grateful to our family for everything we've done for him. Jacob, I'm right. Jacob couldn't take it anymore. But he realized that his half-brother was provoking him on purpose. So he kept his cool. For the sake of respect and remembrance, Frank, I won't be rude here. But you, Kevin, don't take credit for other people's accomplishments. You personally have done nothing for me. Oh, brother, if you yourself deny my good treatment of you, then I will draw the appropriate conclusions. But not now, because my father's memory is sacred to me too. Kevin, I emphasized my word on purpose. The lawyer listened without interfering in the brothers' squabble, but there was something in his behavior that Betty did not like. Wasn't it too soon? You began to break the spears in the struggle for the inheritance. After all, according to the law, you have to wait 6 months. Jacob interrupted the woman. Mom, I'm not going to ruin my life by fighting over property. My family is more important to me. Let Kevin, like that fairy tale Kashi, languish over his gold. Jacob left without saying goodbye to anyone, and this did not escape the attention of the main heir. This upstart is going to give me a hard time. I thought he'd ask me nicely to keep him in the company, and he's doing his pretzels. Betty stood up for Jacob. Kevin, don't you hate listening to yourself? Why are you leaving your brother? And Jacob is right about a lot of things, and I support him. The man screamed, Mom, stop calling him my brother. There is no kinship between us, and I don't care what Jacob does with his life. Betty didn't say another word. She realized that it was useless to talk to a man who was obsessed with incomprehensible hatred, relying on her life experience. The woman believed that in time the disagreement would be resolved, and the brothers would find a solution satisfactory to both sides. She left the law office without even turning around. Betty's soul overflowed with anxiety, and she decided to consult with Jenna Jacobs' wife. Her mother-in-law told her daughter-in-law about the details of the conversation. And at the end, she added, "We were difficult to get along as children. Probably his character prevents him from finding a life partner. Perhaps he's mad with loneliness. I didn't say anything at the time. I thought my mother-in-law was right. It's unbearable to live with a man like that." But what alarmed the young woman more than anything else was that after her father's death, Kevin began to take it out on the family. It was as if he was possessed by an insatiable thirst for revenge. After dinner, she decided to share her concerns with her husband. I don't like this. Maybe we should get away from here. Jenna, I can't leave my mom with that bastard. He's not just getting back at me, he's getting back at her. Where does he get his anger from? He's hated me since I was a kid. I was just a kid when my father died. But I remember how Kevin greeted me. He gave me some pepper juice, and I almost died. I had to call an ambulance. My father, of course, punished me. We should encourage him to do more of the same. Previously, the husband never told about his brother's childish actions, and the young woman was horrified. What savagery? You poor thing. You've been through so much. Yes, I've been through a lot, but I don't like to think about it. Of course, I've always had a bad relationship with Kevin. I've tried many times to change things, but you can't do it unilaterally. As children, many people don't get along well even with their siblings, and there are many reasons for that. But I don't understand why Kevin is climbing the wall right now. I mean, he's already got everything in his will. What's he missing? Nanny, I don't understand it myself. I didn't want to tell you, but I get the impression that my brother is determined to destroy me personally. Jacob, that's why we have to leave. Think about it. Imagine Kevin's already told the kid he's going to throw us out on the street. This news took the man by surprise. He stared out the window in silence for a while, as if gathering his thoughts. Anna knew it was best not to disturb her husband at such times. After a brief pause, Jacob said thoughtfully, "Jenna, I think but he won't be able to throw us out on the street. All the documents for this apartment are in order. But even if he finds a scythe on a stone, we have my father's apartment. I'm more worried about something else. Not looking my husband straight in the eye. Do you think there's something wrong with the will, too? Jacob looked away. I don't know what to think. But in the last hours of his life, Father was in remembrance and spoke to us. He said he'd made a fair arrangement for us. The contents of the will told a different story. She hugged her husband. Jacob, no offense, but Kevin has a point. He's the natural son and therefore the rightful heir. And I don't exclude that Frank had that fact in mind when he talked about justice. I don't care about the damn inheritance in principle. If I had a head for it, a job can always be found. Let Kevin enjoy his wealth. Jacob, but you've invested a lot in the company too. Isn't that a shame? Jacob did not want to admit to his wife that he was uncomfortable with everything that was happening lately. He didn't tell her that his half-brother was demanding the money that his late father had given him to buy a car and an apartment. Jenna, I think I'm going to go visit my mom tomorrow. Would you like to keep me company, and can I take it? Grandma would love to have you as a guest. You're doing great. You know, there's something I want to ask Betty. I want to ask her some questions, too. This conversation brought some clarity and a little peace to the couple before bedtime. Jenna looked into her son's room and mentally wished him sweet dreams. Before falling asleep, she thought that she was very lucky to have a husband. It was rare to find such sincere yet strong men like Jacob these days. Betty decided to check on her eldest son. She was well informed about the company's affairs, because for a long time she had done the bookkeeping herself. But her husband's illness required her constant presence near him, so she had to leave her favorite job. The woman did not warn Kevin about her visit. She walked confidently into the reception area and almost bumped into the receptionist. Molly, good to see you. The chief in the secretary's seat, looking around confused, and she didn't answer the chief's mother's question right away. Yes, he's there, but he's got Peter. Betty was surprised, for her late husband had not been too fond of the swindler. I wonder what this adventurer had come with. Molly mumbled something related again. This unnatural lethargy of the always energetic secretary alerted the widow. She came closer to her and scrutinized her face. What's the matter with you? You don't look like yourself today. The secretary burst into tears on Betty's shoulder. Kevin fired me. Today's my last day on the job. It's not for me. I came with him. He's already hired a new secretary. I've already packed my things. The woman grinned bitterly and pointed to a box that stood orphaned near the office filing cabinet. Betty strode determinedly toward the door. Don't cry, Molly. I'll try to settle this matter now. She swung the door open without a knock. Kevin jumped up in surprise. Mom, why didn't you warn me? Peter also jumped up from his chair in surprise and hurriedly removed some documents from the table. He pulled out his little eyes in fright. In a low voice, Kevin said, I think we better postpone this conversation until a more convenient time. I'll leave you to it, clutching the file folder to my chest. Peter paid for the house to the door. He wasn't very good at this mode of transportation, and Betty couldn't hold back a smile. The woman wished the visitor a haunting farewell. Good day to you, Peter. Excuse me for interrupting your conversation. Peter also smiled back. That's all right. I understand. Family comes first, so to speak. Betty made sure the door was shut tight and walked over to the table where her son was seated. Kevin had already returned to his usual state and asked defiantly, What's the occasion for you to be a mom? I don't like to think that you've decided to control me. Betty tried to ignore his son's defiant tone. If you're trying to piss me off, you're doing a bad job, and I'd also like to tell you that you're in that chair too soon. You should be ashamed of people. The ground hasn't had a chance to cool off since your father's funeral, and you're already running your own company. I have every right. You were present at the reading of the will. Emotions are inappropriate. Betty is silent and fixed her gaze so intently on Kevin's face that he ate and got along. Mom, what are you doing? I'm just looking at you and wondering if that insolent asshole son. Kevin's face became new, and his hands were fidgeting with the papers on the table. Mom, could you be a little more careful with your language? After all, your son is the head of the company now. It's written all over the water. The young man hovered over his mother, his eyes lightening. What are you trying to say? Only that I have huge doubts about the authenticity of the document that your lawyer read out. The woman stood up and walked with a determined step towards the door. Mom, stop. Explain what you're implying. Kevin, even though you are my son, I won't tolerate meanness, even from you. Why did you kick Molly out? I don't like her work. From you, my trembling mother. I didn't expect that attitude either. Another normal mother would be happy for her son. She said some nasty things on my behalf. If words of truth disgust you, then I truly feel sorry for you. And I also want to remind you, Kevin, that you have no right to make decisions about the future of this company. If you're going to make a questionable deal with this crook, Peter Jacob and I will oppose it. She walked to the door and felt her son's unkind gaze sleep in her back only at the exit. A simple maternal desire to protect her child made her turn around. Kevin, I beg you nicely, stop. Hatred and anger will not do you any good. You can burn in the fire of those feelings yourself. The secretary was waiting impatiently for her in the waiting room. The tearful eyes of this old woman. There was still hope. She asked Betty timidly, "What did Kevin say?" "I'll help you find another job." Seeing that the woman was ready to start crying again, the chief's mother advised her, "And don't be afraid of change, because more often than not, it's for the better. You know my phone number. Call me in a couple days about the job. I'm sure we won't have a problem with that." After his mother left, Kevin sat in the same position for almost an hour. At first a volcano raged inside him, and then fear crawled out of the back of his mind. It's familiar. Ever since he was a kid, the feeling had appeared when his failures were laughed at school. It often arose when his mom gave a piece of her love to Jacob. He was always very afraid that his mom would stop loving him altogether, so he didn't want to share her with anyone. But there was another side to this fear. Kevin was afraid that one day his skein would be revealed. His mother had been very clear about that, and it was no accident that she had reminded him of the board of directors. He had not forgotten about that decisive body. And Peter, who had promised him a solid share of the total income if the deal went through. Kevin struck the table with all his might with his fist, obliged to remove all obstacles. "Even if it be someone very close to me." He said the last words in a half-whisper, but into the open office door. Molly could hear them well. After Betty left, she still hoped that the young chief would still come out and ask her to stay. But his last words made the woman leave the office quickly. She, too, had become very afraid. Since early morning, Betty had been laboring in the kitchen. Jacob had called the day before to say that the family was coming to visit. Since her husband's death, they had never gotten together. But most of all, the woman was happy to be pampered. She idolized her grandson and was ready to fulfill any whim of the little prankster. For several months, the woman got used to cooking several dishes at the same time, so she decided to start early. But surprisingly, the cooking process immediately went. So Betty got better at cooking, and before the arrival of guests, she decided to take a little break in a cozy chair, and herself did not notice how dozed off. But during this hour of rest, she saw not a sweet dream. An alarming memory revived events from her past life. The very first thing that came to mind was the return of her husband after a long business trip. Was not the kind of woman who takes her husband's word for it. When Frank informed her that he had found a job in a neighboring country and would be gone for 2 whole years, she immediately felt that her husband was lying. Frank's father did not believe his son either, as he could not talk about sensitive topics with his wife, Martin. He shared his worries with his daughter-in-law. "I know about this kind of shift work. Tell me why the employer will give such a generous advance in advance? That's one fact. And the other is time. Men from our yard go on shift more often than not. But the biggest is for 6 months. And here it's 2 whole years. So I put it all together. And I realized that our Frank and his buddy went off to war somewhere. Just from the word go. Yay. And then a cold shiver ran through my body. Martin, well, it's against the law for us to engage in such activities. Don't you know that the law is like a rule of thumb? Whoever wants it can always find a loophole. In short, I'm sure our boys are out there. What can people do when there's no work and families need to be fed? Noticing that his assumption scared his sister-in-law, Martin gave the scout a reprieve. Don't worry about it. Who knows what kind of crazy idea an old man might have? Maybe it's something else entirely. And which Polak has a plantation with which Polak? The young woman also tried not to think about bad things, but since that conversation, she'd had a lot of bad thoughts in her head. It was a bit of a relief to see James's wife. Their friendship was a kind of continuation of their husband's brotherly relationship. Almost every evening they called back and shared the latest news. And on weekends, the women together with the boys went to the dacha, where they helped their parents. Frank is missing. Conclusion of the beds. Martin a little trade at the local market greens and gifts of their acreage. Mother-in-law became famous throughout the neighborhood for her culinary abilities. But small business did not suit these already old, but very enterprising people. One day, the couple decided to create their own company and attract to this useful business daughter-in-law. As usual, on the rights of the head of the family daughter-in-law. This was reported by Martin. My mother and I decided to become businessmen, although it sounds ridiculous. But we really want to get rich at least in our old age. And what's it like for you and I? At the time, she was working as an accountant in a hospital and didn't think of making any changes in her life. But she couldn't resist the pressure. She helped her husband's parents to draw up the paperwork and found suitable premises for the store. Although the general business did not immediately go uphill, stable income allowed the family to stay afloat. Ray described in detail in a letter to her husband about all the changes. But Frank was at first skeptical of the idea of opening a business. But almost just before returning planted the innovation James to create in a retail outlet, that their husbands should be coming home soon. Cindy and learned from their letters. But there was no triumphant return. Instead, a man in all black showed up at work one day and told her that James had died heroically and that she had not heard from him. He slipped an envelope of money into the widow's trembling hand and promptly disappeared. A little later came a letter from Frank informing her that he was being treated in the hospital. The husband returned 3 months later and did not immediately recognize in the worst man with the highest honors of hair of his cheerful Frank. Only at home was he able to tell his wife of James' death and of his injury. The husband was very much affected by the loss of his friend. He could not sleep at night, and if he slept, he often picked up. It was very hard to watch the torment of the spouse. So she recommended Frank to him. Maybe you should see a doctor. Why? To put me in the hospital. Why go straight to the hospital and get a prescription so the nightmares won't bother you? I can handle myself without doctors. Frank told his wife about his friend's last request, and together they helped the young widow. The little one was with them almost all the time. Despite the help, it was difficult to lift the baby alone, so she transferred to the infectious disease department for the sake of high earnings. There is a big bonus for harmfulness. Of course, there are risks, but if all the requirements are strictly observed, the risk of infection is nil. But apparently, Cindy did not take into account something, because during the next flu epidemic she fell ill herself. For several days, the young woman hid her illness from everyone for fear of losing her good income. She took pills to bring down her fever. That's what she was caught doing one day. Cindy, what kind of pills are you taking? Her friend, unconcerned, waved her hand. It's nothing. Just a little fever. Olda, it's not dangerous for Jacob. Maybe he should stay with us for a few days until you're better, if you're right. A little extra caution wouldn't hurt. Frank brought surveillance to their house, and 3 days later Cindy was wanted from work. Called their home phone. Unfamiliar woman. Sorry to bother you, but James didn't show up for work this morning. You're friends with her. Do you know where she is? She hung up and called her husband. Frank, I think there's trouble. I'll stay with the kids. You go check on her. I don't feel so good in my heart. A man found his friend's wife unconscious. Apparently, Cindy had gotten up in the morning and was going to go to work, but had collapsed near the bathroom. Frank immediately called an ambulance and the woman was taken to the hospital, but the doctors were unable to save her. She died on the 4th day without regaining consciousness. Already a young doctor helplessly waved his hands. If she had turned earlier, everything would have been fine. But the process had taken a different form. Unfortunately, medical professionals are most often victims of their own recklessness. Like James, she had no family. She too was raised in an orphanage, dreaming of becoming a nurse. This courageous woman saved more than one human life, but she herself died of a trivial infection. Consciousness refused to accept this truth, but life went on. And little Jacob needed parental love and care. By mutual consent, the couple formalized guardianship over the baby. Initially, they wanted to adopt a boy, but then they would have had to change his middle name and surname. But Frank refused to take that step. It's not for the kid's heroic father to decide. James deserved to have his son carry his last name and middle name. The official in the custody department looked at the man with an uncomprehending stare. Does the middle name matter? And it's just the initials of the full name. The main thing is that the boy should be well taken care of. For some it is just a name, but for others it is the roots that keep a person on this earth. The official looked arrogantly at the guardian, but said nothing. Little Jacob quickly settled into the family and hardly ever remembered his mom. Only Kevin was reluctant to accept the new member of the family, although he used to play with the baby with pleasure. Her son's jealousy frightened her, and she feared that this dislike would one day grow into something more. She shared her fears with her husband, but Frank reassured his wife. Boys are always competing for the right to be the best, the bravest. So it's no surprise that Kevin doesn't want to share us with Jacob. Frank, but you got to do something about it. Don't, it'll pass with time. But it turns out Frank was wrong. Dad Betty didn't realize it until now. Kevin had learned to disguise his dislike by being overly demanding of his younger brother. In front of his parents, he was happy to show off his knowledge and skills. Jacob also studied well, but he never flaunted his accomplishments. Betty suddenly rose from her chair and headed for her husband's office, repeating as she went, "How could I have forgotten about this? He's coming today, and I'm going to show him his diplomas." Her late husband had a habit of collecting all receipts and other documents. Since his passing, Betty had never once crossed the threshold of his office. Today was the first time she decided to break that vow to retrieve Jacob's letters of commendation from the archives. Where are they? This was the last place I saw them. The woman rummaged through folders of documents until she came across a transparent file on which the draft of my will was written in familiar handwriting. My heart rolled frantically in my chest, but the bell rang, and Betty didn't have time to read the document with the folder. She ran out into the hallway to greet the guests and shoved the find into the nightstand drawer. In a minute, the happy grandmother completely forgot about her find because all her attention turned to the joint dinner reminded of the good old days. The young spouses praised her and boasted of their successes, but all three of them were careful to avoid the subject of the inheritance and Kevin's ugly behavior. Betty went out to see the guests again and remembered about the folder. She and Nick were already at the elevator when she stopped Jacob. "Son, I'm going to be a minute. I found an interesting file in my father's desk today." "You're more legally literate. Read what's in it." The man hid the file in his pocket. "Okay, Mom, I'll study it tonight. Thank you for dinner." "You too, kids. Thanks for remembering." She stood on the doorstep of the apartment and listened to the elevator descend. Betty wanted to close the door but heard her son's voice. "Mom, wait, Kevin was coming down from the top floor for some reason." This puzzled the woman. "Kevin, how did you get down here?" Of course, it's a reasonable question. I wasn't invited to dinner. Her son's tone and defiant behavior did not please the woman. "Kevin, why do you see malice in simple things? I was called yesterday, and I really missed the Cape ladies. I know you care more about strangers than your only son. Kevin, let's not fight in the middle of the night. Come to the apartment, I had dinner. Oh, I even had the great honor of eating the leftovers from the bar's table. I'm not being sarcastic. No one's offering you leftovers." Kevin walked without taking off his street shoes straight into the living room. He looked at the table, from which the hostess had not yet managed to clear. The man began to take appetizers from the plates with his hands. He ate greedily, keeping his eyes on his mother. "If it's no secret, what have you been talking about all evening?" Kevin, I'll get you a clean plate. Please sit down and eat properly. Mom, you're getting off topic. They were probably talking at the top of their lungs about me. Betty sat across from her son. I can't figure out what you're trying to do. All right, I'll tell you. All I need at this point is your signatures. Kevin wiped his greasy hands with the tablecloth. He hoped to piss his mother off, but she didn't give in to his provocations. She stood up from the table, signaling that the conversation was over. Kevin, I'm not signing anything. Your father and grandfather didn't work so hard for you that you blow it all away in one day. The man's up too. All right, we'll leave it at that for now. But I know a remedy that will make you more cooperative. Unexpectedly, Betty said quietly to Kevin, I found a draft of Daddy's will. Kevin choked and coughed. He was having trouble breathing. But Betty continued in the same quiet voice. Kevin, I'm afraid you're going to go too far for this not to happen. I owe it to you to tell you the most important thing. What Kevin heard from his mother made him furious. He automatically swung at the woman, but his hand froze in midair because the woman fell soundlessly to the floor. A sticky feeling of fear gripped him, and he stared at his mother for a while. Then he rushed to the front door, but came back again. He bent over the motionless body and timidly called out for Mama. Mom, the ambulance came quickly, and Betty was taken to the hospital. The doctor indifferently noted your mom's symptoms as a stroke. But I could be wrong. Betty spent almost 3 months in the hospital, but the consequences of the disease were terrible. The woman couldn't speak or move around on her own. Jacob was sleepy. The first days practically did not leave the bed of the sick, which also very much annoyed Kevin. One day the spouses came and did not catch a relative in the room post-nurse. To their legitimate question, answered your Betty, taken by the son. All the documents and discharge we also gave him in his hands. They did not expect such a turnaround. Jacob tried to call his brother several times, but he did not answer. Then he went to the office, although he really didn't want to meet with Kevin. Everything was working out in his favor. And Kevin was not even embarrassed by the fact that it was his fault that his mother had become an invalid when Jacob came to see him. Anticipating his half-brother's question, he replied briefly, if you are interested in my mother's whereabouts, I can tell you that she is in a safe place. I have placed her in a good private hospital. There is good care there, so I am calm for my mother. Kevin didn't even offer Jacob a chair, and he was being his usual swaggering self. And there are more questions. Yeah, Jenna and I want to visit Mom. Where is this clinic? You don't want to disturb her. Mom needs complete peace and quiet and no negative emotions. Actually, I asked that no one be allowed to see her. Jacob realized there was nothing more he could get out of this man. I hear you. He wanted to leave, but the owner of the office stopped him. You don't want to tell me anything about any classified documents. No, I thought you and I had more to talk about than my mother's health. Go ahead, I'm listening. Come on, Jacob, take it easy. Sit down. Listen to me. Jacob came back and seated himself on a chair opposite the table at which his brother was sitting. I'm listening to you very carefully, though it's not hard to guess what you want from me. If you are so all-knowing, speak. Yes, this is a good time for me to tell you what I think. If you want me to sign off on this deal you're about to make, you can't expect that, nor do I believe in the sudden unhappiness. And another Kevin will, which you replaced with Kevin. Get the hell out of my office. You're not going to make it. We'll see about that. And don't, Kevin, threaten my family. If you do, I'll have you whipped. Jacob left the office and carefully closed the door behind him. He was satisfied that he had said everything to the scoundrel in his eyes. But it was too early to jump to conclusions, because at his request was still investigating. Jacob kept in constant contact and even yesterday asked him to clarify where the loving son hid his mother. When the man almost reached home, he received a call from his wife. Jacob stopped by the grocery store, please. I forgot to buy milk. Nick is demanding cocoa. All right, I'll fulfill your order. But isn't it a little late for that drink? Don't think I'm any dumber than you. It's for breakfast. You know our son is used to having a snack at home and then still tucking in at daycare. Jacob smiled at the pleasant thoughts of his son. He smoothly pulled up the grocery store and went shopping. Engrossed in his thoughts, the man paid no attention to the two types who also got out of the car that followed him. The faces of these stout fellows were covered with a hood. Jacob took a muffin and a cookie besides the milk and headed for the cash register, but on the way, he was roughly pushed by one of the guys. Jacob almost held his ground and reprimanded the aggressive customer. "Couldn't you be more careful?" The guy stopped too. "Is you dude telling me this? Did you push me?" Jacob didn't want to get into an altercation and hurriedly paid up, but the two thugs kept up with him. They prevented him from reaching the car and threw him on the snow. Jacob felt something heavy descend on his head. Anna looked at her watch and could not understand where her husband had disappeared to. She dialed his number several times, but no one answered. Some unknown force made her get dressed and go outside. It was late, and there were hardly any passersby on the streets. Jenna walked around the yard, but their car was not in the parking lot. Then the woman went to the store where they usually bought groceries. The grocery store was already closed, and in the parking lot she saw Jacob's car. Her legs gave out and she almost fell over, noticing a large bloody stain in the white snow. An unfamiliar man over a meal of the species eagerly told her, "There was a fight here about an hour ago. I went to the store to get fuel, and I see two guys hitting a third guy with rebar. Must have had a beef. They got into a fight, but my case is small. I'm just a witness." With unruly lips, the man who was beaten asked somewhere. The homeless man cheerfully answered how they took him away in a bag, packed him up and took him away. First, the cops came. They asked everyone what about me. I told them everything I saw with my own eyes. I didn't make anything up. She doesn't remember how she got to the apartment. She didn't call the hospitals because she was afraid to hear back. That evening sank forever over the horizon, the sun, her happiness. Only in the morning she learned that the victim of the attack of unknown scumbags was her husband. But an inner voice told her unhappiness. Couldn't have happened without Kevin's involvement. To say goodbye to the dead at the hands of bandits came former employees of the company, received from everyone words of condolence and automatically thanked acquaintances and strangers for their participation. She left with a neighbor who herself volunteered to help the young widow. Kevin also showed up at the ceremony with a huge bouquet of scarlet roses and a rich wreath. Jenna will accept my words of condolence. Thank you, Kevin. Hang in there, Jenna. And remember, you can come to me any minute, right? After all, we're not strangers. The very presence of this man was arousing the most contradictory feelings in the young woman's soul. But she did not want to dig into herself in such an inappropriate situation. So she remained silent, her head low. Suddenly, she heard a familiar female voice very close by. There's a reason for all this. I don't believe in accidents, especially not accidents like this. When I was leaving that damned company, I overheard him say that he would remove all the pawns from his chessboard, and he took out first my mother and now my brother. That female voice began to drift away, and Jenna turned around. She saw Frank's former secretary talking to another woman, forgetting about decorum rather than hurrying after them, and caught a snippet of phrase they're all murky with wills and family ties, grabbed the woman's arm. "Molly, stop please." The woman looked around fearfully, then looked at the widow. "Did you want to ask me something?" "Yes, I'm sorry. I overheard your conversation, and I'd like to know. Did the secretary put her hands out in front of her?" No. Is that what you think it is? I don't know anything." Molly took her friend under her arm, and they hurried towards the exit. But they heard the secretary say, "I don't want to lose my head for knowing too much." The women didn't get far. Kevin showed up. "Jenna, are you sick?" "No, I'm fine." "What did those ladies say to you?" Nothing. But I saw the way you two were talking. Kevin, you forget everything. Since when do I have to answer to you?" She barely got away from stalking her dead husband's brother. And when she got home, she began to think not about how to live her life, but how to restore the truth. She realized that Kevin was only holding back his mother for now. Once she was gone, he would get what he wanted. Of course, it was likely that he wouldn't be interested in Nick after that either. And if not, if his hatred is so strong that he decides to get rid of Jacob's son as well. She stayed up all night. By morning, she decided that the first thing to do was to pretend to be a foolish fool who absolutely believed in everything. The second thing is to hide it, and the third thing is to track it down. How would she do all that? I didn't know yet. Nick was too young to be left with anyone for long. There was no one she could trust with her son. Or was there? She wasn't looking out the window. A long time ago, about 7 or 8 years ago, she had a friend, her best friend, with whom they shared all the joys and sorrows that young girls have a whole bunch. They met at the institute and never parted again. From that moment, Jenna thought she had a sister. My physics teacher also said that if the law of attraction were not so undeniable, I would walk and run exclusively on the ceiling. It was maddeningly sad that they would see less of each other, but she understood the need for space. She's like the wind. She couldn't live within 4 walls. She couldn't live any other way. Every year, their friendship grew stronger. In their 3rd year, at the very end, they met and disappeared. They had a fantastic love affair that started at first sight. Then Jenna introduced Jenna to. Tried to say something else. You'll thank me later for the jokes. Get out. Won't refuse to help her. Heaven never would. Where do I look? She took the phone. Since she was calling from a new number, it was unlikely her old one would answer, but she decided to try her luck. Hello, she stretched out. This was getting interesting. Jenna walked slowly from corner to corner. She hadn't taken to the garden today. There just wasn't any energy. It was unlikely Kevin would look after her. Not right away. He's sure that right now she's lying there grief-stricken and incoherent. She did feel that way. If it hadn't been for Nick, she would have stepped out of the window yesterday. But she has a son. She has to make sure he's not in any danger. She just has to find out who is responsible for Jacob's death and bring that person out into the open. That it was the Bones, Jenna had no doubt, of course. But to everyone else, her certainty wouldn't be enough. Not an hour later, the doorbell rang. Jenna rushed to it and looked through the peephole, then quickly swung it open and literally pulled her inside. The woman immediately hugged her. I was watching the news on the way over. I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you, I'm holding on with all my might. They were talking softly in the kitchen, and neither noticed when Nick appeared. He, as is his child's custom to be polite, said hello loudly. The women jumped. Oni jumped up, scooped her son up in her arms. Sonny, I didn't hear you wake up, but I did. What are we having for breakfast? And who is this auntie? She put him in her chair. This aunt is my friend the realist. The realist, like my friend. Even better, Nick shook Nick's outstretched hand. The woman's eyebrows darted upward. Wow, that's official. Nick remembered something. He looked at his mother, and his eyes began to quickly fill with tears. Hurry to him, sunshine. What do you have? Porridge or scrambled eggs? Nick immediately forgot about the tears. He always had to eat only porridge in the mornings only Daddy ate. Mom said that he had to grow up a little bit, and then he could eat scrambled eggs too. Can I have some? Really? Of course you can. You're a man, my helper and protector. While Nick waited for his eggs, he got to know his neighbor. What do you do for a living? I'm a lifeguard. The boy's eyes got huge. A real one who saves people. That's the one. I have a lot of pictures on my phone. You want to see them? Very much. Took a quick look at. I have a place like this, honestly. Is that what you think about going all together tomorrow and looking at it? Nick put both hands up in the air. I'm going. And my mom, well, my mom too, of course. Laughed, but not just her and my parents. She didn't argue any further. She had heard before a long time ago that the parents of the world, and even when she broke the nose of the local huge, they did not scold her, but stood up in her defense and in the end, proved that the one tried to molest her. All told, holding grief inside makes it hard on yourself and your son. You don't think he feels it. So that's what you go to the river, sit there and cry, and then come back. And they looked at her in surprise. Nick. The older woman smiled that Nick, look how he and his grandfather are interested. Here they are already drawing a slide. What they will do and go, we will not offend from. We don't know when you'll have grandchildren. At least we'll have a good time. Kevin paced the office. He couldn't figure out where Jenna had disappeared to. He should have nailed her right away, searched the house, and he would have found everything. But no, he'd gone to celebrate another victory. Now this victory threatened to be a real failure, even though Jenna had never been known for her resolute character. Jacob was the one to be feared because he could get to the bottom of anything. Jenna was not like that. But as the saying goes, God protects the wiser. Kevin sat down in the chair and tried to calm down. There are two possibilities. Jenna knows something, and she's afraid, so she hides. In that case, she could just sit there, afraid for herself and her son, and do nothing. The option is not bad, but Kevin, it will still bring some anxiety, because at any moment his peace of mind can be broken. Option 2, she simply decided to change the environment in connection with the death of her spouse. Also quite realistic, and even much more suitable to the truth, but as something very weakly believed. And then there's Jacob's wife, and there's a son Kevin wanted nothing to remind him of Jacob in this life. It turns out that he's not satisfied with any of the options. That meant only one thing. He had to look hard, before the proverbial 6 months were up. Of course, she's nobody, but oh so much. But where to start? Kevin picked up the phone at 600 in the mall parking lot, disconnecting the chassis, rubbing his hands together. They would search Jacob's apartment today, and sure enough, he was sure of it. Would they find anything? He had some not-so-good figures in his aides as of late. But he didn't care. They'd sell their mother for money, and they had the money. So he's in charge now. He was almost running around the room. Things had gotten very, very complicated. Now he was sure they knew something. Whether she'd thought of everything or grabbed all the papers and just started to rely on chance was impossible. And to know what was in that folder Mom had given Jacob. Kevin stopped suddenly, or maybe there was no folder. Maybe they were all just trying to scare me. The thought appealed to him, but he'd have to check it out. His mother's nurse called yesterday, saying she'd started saying some words. We should go see her. It took him 3 days to get out to see his mom. He was driving along a snow-covered road that led to one of the nearest villages, and thinking that it would be nice if Mother died before she could speak fully when he took her to the village nurse. He hoped very much that his mother wouldn't make it out of such a state, and if she did, he hoped she could. He pounded the steering wheel forcefully. The car backed up, and Kevin struggled to catch the road again, pulled the protruding vapor on his forehead, and slowed down a little. You've got to be more careful. You could crash like that. His mother met him with a meaningful look that, frankly, gave him goosebumps. So it turns out he's right about everything. He should get rid of the mother, too. Maybe give the woman some money. He looked at the woman with kind eyes. No, that wouldn't do it. After sitting for a while for propriety, asking what changes his mother had made, he got ready to leave. Leaned over to nuzzle her cheek. But the woman mooed, and he heard clearly, I know everything. Kevin straightened up sharply. Yes, you've done a great job. I think it's up to the doctors to take it from here. I'll be there in a couple days to pick up the mother. Or a special. A car will be coming from the clinic. Have a good day. He walked out without letting the woman get a word in edgewise. She wanted to tell him that Betty had made tremendous progress in the 3 days he hadn't called. She's saying so many words, but she's making progress. And she's already knocking on the door. The day I sent her to the river. The woman walked for a long time in the white snow. She became such fanciful paths. Cried many tears, changed her mind a lot. And when she returned to the house, she realized that she really felt better. At home, they were already serving dinner. She suddenly remembered that for several days she had been living only on coffee. Yes, and her stomach confirmed it with a weak growl. Nick was so tired that he fell asleep, barely leaving the table. Jenna sat down on the floor and shook out of her bag all the papers she had brought with her. She went through each and every piece of paper one by one, rereading that file labeled draft will. Yes, the way the draft was written completely confirmed not only their suspicions, but more like Frank's decision. It couldn't. The person who drafted the will then change it so drastically. Especially since he and Jacob had never had any quarrels. They had already started to put all the papers back into the file, while thinking about where to hide all this good stuff for the time being. Another piece of paper fell into their laps. It was noticeably different in color from all the other papers. At first, I thought it was just a sheet of paper. Took it in my hands, turned my eyebrows up. That can't be right. I absolutely refused to stay home. What are you, Jenna? You'd be lost without me. But what about Nick? She looked at her son, who was busily helping her weave or knit something. In fact, in the few days they'd been here, Nick hadn't left the man's side. They'd even been a little jealous. Yeah, why would I disappear? They don't argue. Nick will be fine with Mom and Dad. It's so nice when they don't bug me about the grandkids. But how could Jenna argue? Especially since I really was so much calmer around them. There was a family council that evening. But is there anything for you? It's just that Vanya has a nice roomy car. And he's a big guy himself. Besides, Ivan will never refuse to help you. She looked at him with interest. She had never asked her a question about the car. On the woman. We're taking her away. Her son wants to send her to the afterlife. The woman suddenly sat back in her chair. I knew it. Something told me that it's not easy to take a man in such a state to the middle of nowhere. What's that supposed to mean? Setting me up. And if you had a hunch, why did you agree? The woman waved her hand. My son made a mess of things and disappeared. And I'm ashamed in front of people. I'm paying for him. Kevin pays well. She's a woman now. I won't stop you. I can see that when he comes, Betty is very nervous. She's really pleased with you, not approached by a woman. What about you? He'll be asking you. The woman waved her hand again, and I'm going to my sister's. She's been calling me for a long time, but I'm still afraid. I'm afraid of losing this magnifying glass. Kevin paced the office again. He wasn't just a smart guy, he was a real businessman. There's not much left, a little push and the deal's in his pocket. Kevin had gone over everything Peter had left him 10 times. The terms were even better than Kevin originally thought. Now he and his son are going to squash them like bedbugs. Then he'll find her, deal with her mother, so that, God forbid, she doesn't get up. She won't say too much. Then he'll finalize the deal with Peter. And that's it. Then he can go on with his life and not think about a thing. He would have found her a long time ago. Yeah, there wasn't time. Now that the inheritance is just a few days away, he'll work hard to find her. Heaven to you. The girl did not have time to finish because she was rudely pushed back, and one of those who would do anything for money entered the office. We found your nurse. She's free. The secretary slammed the door resentfully. Kevin shuddered. It's time to fire her. Apart from her figure, there's nothing interesting about her. It was the third secretary in a few months. The man relaxed in his guest chair. For the first time in all this time came the thought that if this man was not satisfied, he would kill him without blinking an eye. And for free. Kevin walked around the chair and sat down in his own chair. And I take it, since you've shown up so brazenly, there's news. We found a nurse, had a little visit from her. Your mom was taken away by 2 women. I showed you a picture of your brother's wife. It was her. A guest in the audience said he's not my brother. I don't care who he is, just give me the money. I've already paid you. What you paid is long over. Kevin realized there was no point in arguing. It's better to pay. How many times had he promised himself? How many times had he promised himself he wouldn't mess with this contingent again? And now he understood perfectly well that only such people could solve such cases, which he had all the time. And all because they went against the law. Kevin calmed himself with the fact that his relatives simply left him no choice. Everyone knew perfectly well that only he should be the only and undisputed heir. None of them had any right even to the rubles that belonged to Kevin, and it had belonged to him much earlier than his father had died. Kevin was very sorry that he had called an ambulance for his mother. It was because at that moment his son's feelings for his mother still meant something to him. And he called the ambulance not because he was afraid for his mother's life, not because he felt sorry for her, but because it was necessary. And how many problems could have been avoided? He could not think that this calmed Jenna to decide to take his mother. And why? She's just a log. Her words, in the state she was in, could mean nothing. Yes, any doctor would say that. But the fear was creeping up inside. When the man got the money and left, Kevin wondered what was most important to him now, what he was moving towards. He was on his way to being in charge, to not be praised by Jacob, but only by him. True, there was no one to praise and be proud of now, but that didn't matter anymore. Kevin has proved that he and only he. It's only a matter of time, and his firm will be the one to take off. We need to hurry up and come up with some compelling reasons to sign the papers sooner. After all, in a few days, he'll be the full owner anyway. And then, after signing the documents, he would simply rename the company and make sure that no one would ever reach out his hands to it. Kevin was sure that no one would dare, but he considered himself a very short-sighted person, so he decided to do it this way. He was not accustomed to put things off in a long box of time. He had no time to look for his mother and the jar, or rather he might not have time to find them before the will came into force. All in all, the stars were aligning just the way he needed them to. Kevin dialed the number. "Is there a problem?" Sure." "Kevin, don't I recognize you?" "I take it you've read everything I left you." "That's right, Peter. And I've decided not to put things off. I was thinking we could be of some use to each other by now, and we're waiting for some formalities." Kevin felt a trickle of sweat running down his back. He realized that the most important thing now was not to overplay his hand. The opponent in front of him was very cunning. But even though there were rumors about all sorts of rumors, Kevin, after studying the documents, knew for sure that he did not want to spend it. Of course he did. Kevin was very good at it. And even though everyone advised him, "Peter, well, don't talk to anyone without a lawyer," Kevin always arrogantly replied, "You can fool a sucker. And I'm not." Peter was quiet for a while, then he said, "Well, can we meet? Perhaps I will come to you tomorrow." The guest hung up the phone and almost jumped around the office. He felt that now Peter was in his hands, and since he had agreed to meet, he would agree to everything else, that is, to sign the papers early. At this time, Peter was rubbing his hands together. This one just can't wait to put himself in a hole, just to be convincing. Peter tomorrow will reduce his profits by a couple of %, so this upstart will realize how hard it is to make up his mind. Jenna came into town 2 months ago and dropped by her apartment. Strange that Kevin hadn't changed the locks or sold it at all. Then the woman remembered that he hadn't inherited it yet either. She watched the mess made by those who had searched for the papers. She sighed, but didn't touch anything. She was wearing a bright red wig, tracksuit, and sneakers. Who knew and would never have believed it was her? And all because women have always been committed to beautiful and feminine clothes. And the tracksuit, as she thought, it is only for the gym. She had not come to the city to admire the apartment and the trash in it. There was one person they absolutely had to meet, and that person was Anthony. She didn't know that Jacob had been at his father's friend's house for the last time before his death, and it was the case that had gotten him killed. Anthony looked at her with uncomprehending eyes. "I'm sorry, you told the secretary that I was handling your case, but I don't remember you." She made sure once again that the doors were well closed and pulled off her wig. Anthony gasped. "I never would have recognized you in that outfit. You're a master of disguise. Where did you disappear to?" "I tried to find you after I died. I went to your house several times, called you, and nothing. I thought you just left, and I even understood you because it's really hard to stay where you were together." I didn't smile weakly. "You're right, it is really hard. But that's not why we had to leave. It's more serious than that." It was. So Kevin didn't just forge a will. No. It's weird that he has such a hatred for Jacob. I mean, no one lied to him. No one told him Jacob was his own son. Where did it come from? It's like it's subconscious. I can't even figure out what's causing it. She didn't come to the table. She put the folder on the table. "Tell me, can we prove now that the will isn't real?" "Yes, now I have proof." She slid the file to him. "This is a draft of the will, and there's more." She unfolded a piece of paper in front of him. Anthony ran his eyes over it. "It can't be, but he is. He knows about it." "Not thoughtfully," she said. At first, I thought he didn't. And then Jacob had the document. So it wasn't just the Bones parents who knew about it, but my husband as well. Maybe that's why there was such hatred. That there was a logic to it. And then a lot of things are explained. Jenna brought me 40 on my tail that tomorrow Kevin and Peter are going to sign the papers. Of course, we can sue later, but I don't think there's anything to sue for. We have to act tomorrow. Kevin and Peter sat across from each other in the conference room. Kevin had chosen this seat on purpose so that Peter would feel its importance. It was true that their old parent had screwed him by 2%, reducing his profits. But on the other hand, Kevin understood Peter was taking a risk. Kevin knew it, that nothing was going to happen anymore. And here, Peter didn't. Kevin had his lawyer behind him. Behind Peter and him, they paused for a moment to read the documents again. True, Peter only pretended to read. He knew the document by heart. He had drafted it himself and knew perfectly well where the pitfalls lurked. But Kevin didn't see anything. Neither did his attorney or lawyer. There was a greedy light in Bones' eyes. But what? Kevin didn't have time to say. With annoyance, he looked at the door. His stupid secretary was at the door again. She's always getting into trouble. I should really fire her. She's good in bed, of course, as a worker. What else is there? He stood up and then sat down in confusion. People were coming into the office. Rolled a wheelchair in front of him, in which his mother sat like a queen. And the worst thing was that his mother looked at him with meaningful eyes. Following her was another young woman. Next to her was a young man, but a strange man with a beard, a big man. Kevin was very afraid of this man. If he was in this company, it was even worse. But what could they do but talk? Kevin turned to, "Let's sign it." But Peter pushed the documents away from him. He realized at once that it seemed that here, not only to get rich, but in general, you can lose. "Kevin, I hope your relatives have come to support your decision." Kevin jumped up in a rage. "Who cares? I, and only I, decide everything here. Everybody understands. It's all mine because I'm the only native son." He slammed his fist on the table. So the carafe of water bounced, and then he heard his mother's voice. "That's not true, and you know it very well. You are not Frank's own son." Kevin stared at her. He seemed to want to spear her with his gaze. "What are you talking about, you old fool? You should be dead by now." Kevin shouted in a frenzy and did not notice that there were many more people in the conference room. Among them were people in uniform. "Kevin, you found the adoption document when you were only 10 years old. Then you had a terrible tantrum. They even put you in the hospital. When you got out, it was like you didn't remember anything. My father and I thought it was a good thing, especially since everyone around us was sure you were our son. But as recent events showed, you remembered everything and could not forgive Jacob that you were on the same rights as him. Except that no one thought you could do such a thing out of spite and jealousy. You've never been first or successful at anything. Jacob was smarter than you. Jacob had a head on his shoulders. You could only be proud of being Martin's son." Kevin suddenly laughed. "You say Jacob is smarter than me. But tell me, where is your Jacob now? And where am I? And you, Mom, you just happened to survive, though you shouldn't have." Betty looked at me closely. "I knew it was you, but somewhere in the back of my mind I hoped I was wrong." She cried. Kevin finally saw that the room was full of people. Even the firm's employees were crowded in the doorway. Only one man was missing. When and how he vanished, no one noticed at all. "No, you're all going to die. You're all unworthy." Kevin rushed into his office. He had a gun in a drawer there, but he didn't get there in time. That strange bearded man was the quickest to react. He just caught it on the run with one hand and lifted it off the floor. Kevin squealed, tried to bite his arm, and it was him, but he didn't succeed. After a minute, he was led away. Betty said tiredly, "Jesus, if you were alive, he'd take over." "I'm old now." She stopped talking and turned to look at him. She looked at me and didn't say a word. And I didn't fit in. Something's wrong. Of course I'm not sitting right, she lamented. And I, by the way, I have a wonderful daughter-in-law who will understand everything and become a great leader. They're frightened. "No, I can't. Don't tell me. Who did you leave for? Who did you go to unravel all this for? For whom did you torture me outside the lines? For, but none. But it's all going to come to me someday. What do you want him to do? Just get the title." I gave him a stern look. You live 100 kilometers away in a den you don't want to move to the city. So don't mislead people. If you agree to marry me, I'll move back to the city." There was silence in the hall for a second. Jenna stared in amazement. Betty looked at the couple with a smile. Zai threw herself around her neck too. Betty sighed. "But I'm at peace now. You'll have trustworthy people by your side. Now I'm allowed to die." They hugged her. "Don't even think about it. Who's going to help with homework? He's actually going to school this year." "No one. And I don't want to hear any more of this nonsense." It's been a year. There were 3 people walking down the path to the cemetery. A young, beautiful woman who resembled a businesswoman from the cover of a fashion magazine. An elderly woman who leaned on a cane, and a boy about 7 or 8 years old who carefully supported his grandmother. The elderly woman was the first to enter the bed. "Hello, Frank. Hello, my son. You see, I came to you with my own feet, and all thanks to Ad. They didn't abandon me." A sick old woman, but she's fiddling. Nick reached out to. She bent over. "Mom, that Dad and Grandpa can hear Grandma," not crouched, smiled lightly. "Of course she hears Son and even sees them. It's just that we don't see or hear them. But we should know that they're always protecting us." Oni pressed her son and whispered in his ear very quietly. "And the way you study, how you behave at recess, they also see." Nick blushed thickly. "I'm going to behave very well from now on." They stood for a long time at the beautiful monuments, which had been erected 6 months ago. They thought about their own things. It was so easy on their souls, as if they were near them. They were really with the people they cared about. Jenna sighed. "It's time. Jenna, I'm begging you to come." She's refusing to give birth. She's got the whole hospital on edge, yelling about her pain, changing her mind. "Have them give her an injection. Let her go home. She'll be here tomorrow." "What am I going to do?" "We're on our way." She knew and believed it was like that. She dialed the number. "Yes," quietly shrieked on the other end of the phone. "When I told you such words." "There you see, it's all right when you promised, and you'll be all right, just as I promise you." Outside the hospital, they met John with my eyes, who looked as if he didn't recognize them. They had to shake him a few times. He finally looked at her meaningfully. "A girl, a girl we and decided and will name." Jenna was smiling, and tears were running down her cheeks.